So let's have a look at why talents give you energy, and when you're doing something that's not in line with your talents, why it takes energy from you. So from birth, we have the most available connections to learn and absorb new information. And literally our brain, when we come into this world, it's like an electrical storm going on. All these little connections are firing. Part of the function of your brain in your early years or your developmental years is to identify which connections are being used and which connections aren't being used. And the brain does that simply by looking at where's the activity. If there's certain connections that are not firing, then they're obviously not necessary and they're not being used. And what the brain does is it eliminates those unused connections. And so what happens is through our first 16 to 18 years, we have this tapering effect, this dropping off of our available connections. And around about mid to late teens, that plateaus at about 5% of what we started with. So we have 5% of the available connections we started life with. Now, what's happening is that when the brain notices there's certain connections that are being used a lot, they're firing all the time, the brain supports the growth of those connections. It supplies blood and nutrients and oxygen and capillaries and all the infrastructure that the brain needs to build those connections stronger and faster. But if there's some connections that aren't being used, they get removed. And if there's some connections that are just getting used once in a while, well, the brain kind of neglects those. So what you have forming through your formative years is you have some really fast and strong connections, and you've got some really slow and weak connections. Now, when you're learning and growing or developing in an area where you've got strong and fast connections, all the infrastructure's there. So all the brain really has to do is just connect up the wires, just literally make the connections because all the infrastructure's there. And so it's very easy for your brain. It's also quick. That's why it feels, when you're working in an area of natural talent, it feels effortless. It feels like you get energy from it because it's so easy. And you learn quickly. You pick things up quickly. When, on the other hand, you're working in an area of that's weak, those weak connections, there's no infrastructure there. So what the brain's got to do is it's got to first build the infrastructure and then make the connections. And it's really hard work for the brain. And you can imagine to build all that infrastructure takes energy. So there you go. So when you're working in an area where there's weak connections, it actually takes your energy. It feels draining. And it feels hard work. And when you're learning in those areas, your growth curve is very, very flat. You don't learn quickly because it takes a lot of hard work on the brain's part to build those connections and connect them up.